The night the truth finally surfaced, the rain had been falling for hours, drumming against the thin windows of the old family home like a quiet warning that no one wanted to hear. Inside, the living room lights flickered faintly, casting uneven shadows across the walls, making the framed family photos appear almost alive. Watching, judging, waiting for the moment everything would change. At the center of the room sat a folder, unremarkable at first glance. Plain, manila, a little worn at the edges. But inside those pages was the story of a betrayal so calculated, so quietly orchestrated, that it would fracture a family that once believed itself unshakable. It began in stillness, the kind that hangs in the air before a storm breaks. The old clock near the stairway ticked with a rhythm that felt louder than usual, steady and unbothered by the tension rising in the room. Someone had placed the folder there intentionally, almost ceremoniously, as if inviting the truth to step forward and stop hiding behind whispered doubts and unanswered questions. They all stared at it. No one moved toward it, yet everyone knew whatever was inside would expose what they had all silently feared. Before we descend deeper into this story, before we unravel how a single cousin allegedly re-engineered family history to seize a $7,300,000 inheritance, take a moment to ground yourself. Stories like this aren't just mysteries, they're reminders of how fragile trust can be. So let me ask you something different tonight. As you listen, notice the moments where you feel the shift. The first red flag, the first lie, the first fracture. Keep it with you. Let your instincts stay sharp. And if this kind of deep, haunting investigation resonates with you, stay close. There are more truths like this waiting to be uncovered, and you shouldn't miss what comes next. The story traces back almost 2 decades, long before the forged signatures, the manipulated dates, and the quiet bank transfers that would later become the backbone of the case. Back when the family still met every Sunday for dinner in their grandmother's home, a warm, two-story house on the edge of town with a creaking porch and a sprawling backyard that smelled of pine and fading summers. Her name was Cecilia Hartman. Everyone called her Grandma Cece. She'd raised 5 children, survived 2 recessions, built a modest rental business, and eventually expanded it into a small property empire that surprised even her closest friends. Over the years, through smart investments and patient long-term planning, her assets grew far beyond what most people realized. But family fortune has a way of attracting shadows, and the darkest one would come from inside her own bloodline. Her grandson Matthew, quiet, charming, and always composed, had been close to her in ways that appeared heartwarming to outsiders. He helped her with errands, drove her to appointments, and often handled paperwork she found exhausting. People in the neighborhood often described him as the good one, the dependable cousin, the one who stayed behind while others pursued lives in different states. No one suspected him. Not then. Reports from relatives describe Matthew as the kind of person who always seemed to be listening, really listening, but never fully revealing what he was thinking. He dressed neatly, spoke thoughtfully, and carried a calmness that made people trust him easily. But calmness can be its own kind of mask. The family dynamic was shifting in subtle ways even then. Some of the siblings had moved away, others were focused on their own lives or careers, and Grandma Cece, in her mid-80s, relied more and more on those who remained nearby. The estate planning documents, updated periodically through the years, were kept in a locked drawer in her study. Only she had the key, or so everyone thought. And then came the year everything changed. The year her health declined quickly. The year conversations about wills and legacies became more frequent. The year Matthew's visits increased from weekly to nearly daily. Witnesses recall moments that, in hindsight, feel telling: quiet conversations behind closed doors, papers carried discreetly to and from his car, the way he sometimes left the house looking unsettled, yet composed enough to maintain his facade. The tension beneath the surface grew slowly, like a crack in a foundation that everyone senses but no one addresses. When Cece passed away, the family expected grief, of course, but they did not expect what followed. The reading of her will was meant to be a formality. She had always been fair, always clear about her intentions. The estate, valued at $7,300,000, was to be divided evenly among her children and grandchildren. A simple, equitable legacy. But what they were presented with was not the will she had discussed for years. This document was different. Pages that should have been familiar read like a stranger's script. Key provisions were altered. Beneficiaries were rearranged. Entire sections appeared to have been rewritten. And at the center of it all, one detail stood out. The new will left nearly everything to Matthew. Shock rippled through the room as the family sat frozen, eyes scanning signatures that looked almost, but not quite, like Cece's. The lawyer hesitated as he read, and when he reached the end, a heavy silence fell over the space, thick enough to feel like a physical weight pressing on the chest. Someone whispered, "This isn't right." Someone else murmured, "She would never do this." That moment, the moment disbelief turned to suspicion, was the point where the first layer of truth cracked, revealing the darkness beneath. But it would take months before the full scheme was exposed. Before investigators uncovered the forged documents, the backdated pages, the manipulated property deeds, and the digital trail that would ultimately unravel all of Matthew's carefully constructed lies. And even then, the truth did not come cleanly. It surfaced piece by piece, like fragments of a confession that refused to fully come into the light. What happened next is a descent into betrayal so deliberate it continues to haunt the family to this day. A story of calculated deceit, financial manipulation, and the terrifying ease with which one person can bend reality when no one is watching closely enough. This is where the unraveling begins. The unraveling began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with a single phone call made late at night by one of Cece's daughters. She had always trusted her mother's instincts, and the will that had been presented to the family didn't align with anything she remembered from their conversations. She described it later as a cold feeling in the stomach, the unmistakable sense that someone had rewritten not just a document, but the very truth of who Cece was. The attorney who had drafted Cece's previous wills confirmed what the family feared. He had not prepared this new version. He had not met with her in those final months. He had not signed off on any of the changes. What he said next shifted everything. He admitted that his signature on the final page was indeed his, but it was pulled from an older document, not newly written, not valid. That was the first real fracture in Matthew's story. At first, he maintained composure. He claimed Cece had chosen a different lawyer in the last weeks due to scheduling conflicts. He said she'd wanted to simplify things. He insisted the family was misunderstanding her final wishes. But each explanation felt thinner than the one before, stretched too tight over a truth he could no longer fully control. Investigators entered the picture soon after. A quiet but experienced forensic document analyst was brought in, someone known for his ability to detect even the slightest discrepancies in ink, pressure, and stroke patterns. He studied the will for hours, tracing the looping lines of Cece's signature, comparing them to decades of authentic documents. What he found was subtle and almost elegant in its deceit. The signature had been lifted, digitally cleaned, slightly stretched, and reprinted using ink inconsistent with the printer inside Cece's home. The forgery wasn't sloppy, it wasn't rushed. It had been crafted by someone familiar with the family's trust in appearances. While the analyst examined documents, a second team reviewed property deeds. Several were logged as having been transferred 6 months before Cece's death, transfers that allegedly gave Matthew full ownership of her highest valued rental units. But witnesses recalled her health declining sharply during those weeks, her memory fading, her speech sometimes confused. According to medical records, she couldn't have completed legally binding paperwork alone. One investigator later said, "It felt like walking into a house built on sand. Every step revealed something shifting underneath." And still, Matthew held his calm. He spoke softly. He answered questions with the precision of someone used to maintaining a careful persona. But behind that steady voice, it became clear that a different story was playing out in his mind. A story of control slipping through his fingers. A neighbor came forward with a recollection that became a turning point. She reported seeing Matthew leaving Cece's home late one night, carrying a stack of papers tucked under his jacket. She remembered the way he walked, hurried, tense, avoiding the porch light. She hadn't thought much of it then, but now it painted a different scene entirely. Another relative recalled overhearing a conversation months before Cece died, a conversation that, at the time, felt harmless. Matthew had asked his grandmother whether she wanted to simplify things and make sure the estate stayed protected. Cece, confused, had brushed it off. This small fragment didn't prove anything on its own, But when pieced together with the forged signatures and questionable transfers, it changed the tone of the entire case. The investigators worked slowly, methodically, gathering each piece of the puzzle until the image became impossible to ignore. They discovered metadata on digital files that didn't match the dates printed on the documents. They traced email exchanges between Matthew and a notary who later admitted to certifying signatures she had not witnessed in person. They found overlaps, times when Matthew claimed to be out of town, but surveillance footage placed him near the county courthouse. Still, the most chilling uncovering came from something strangely simple. In the bottom drawer of Cece's study, behind a stack of old tax forms, lay an envelope addressed to her attorney. The letter inside was undated, written shakily but clearly in her handwriting. In it, she expressed her desire to keep her estate divided evenly, as always, so no child or grandchild feels favored or forgotten. It was a quiet reminder of who she was, and it stood in direct contrast to the fraudulent will that had surfaced. When confronted with these findings, Matthew didn't lash out. He didn't break down. He didn't confess. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He retreated into silence. He stopped returning calls. He avoided family gatherings. He disappeared into the quiet corners of his home as though hoping the truth would lose interest in him. But truth doesn't lose interest. It waits. A financial audit revealed just how far the scheme had gone. Transfers totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars had moved discreetly into an account registered under a shell business. Rental income had been redirected. Insurance policies had been modified. It wasn't just one forged will. It was a systematic plan, allegedly crafted over years, waiting only for the final signature that would make it almost untraceable. Almost. One of the investigators described the moment the last piece clicked into place. It was like watching the floorboards lift, one by one, until you could see the entire structure beneath. The case eventually reached the district attorney's office, and the family braced themselves for the storm that would follow. But storms don't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they arrive with a soft knock on the door at sunset, when the world outside looks calm, but everything inside is about to change. The day the charges were presented, the tension in the air felt suffocating. Family members gathered again in the same living room where months earlier, they'd stared at the manila folder that started it all. But this time the weight was heavier, trust was thinner, and the cracks between them felt nearly impossible to repair. Matthew walked in quietly, no outburst, no panic, just the same calm expression he'd worn for years. But something in his eyes had shifted. The facade had finally begun to crumble, revealing the truth beneath: fear, desperation, and the unmistakable realization that his carefully built scheme had been exposed from every angle. Even then, he tried to explain. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said he was only doing what he believed was right. But each word only deepened the silence in the room. The family listened, but the truth had already taken shape. It stood between them like a shadow they could no longer ignore. The legal process dragged on for months, and with each passing day, the emotional toll grew. Cece's legacy, once a symbol of unity, had become a battlefield of paperwork, accusations, and unraveling trust. When the verdict finally arrived, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like loss. Not just of money or property or inheritance, but of something far more fragile: the belief that family could be trusted simply because they were family. And in the quiet aftermath, as the house stood empty and the lights dimmed, one haunting truth lingered. Sometimes the person you trust the most is the one who learns how to hide the deepest betrayal. Before we close this story tonight, sit with one thought. Would you have seen the signs, or would you have believed him too? Some betrayals are so skillfully crafted that even the sharpest eyes miss them until the damage is irreversible. If stories like this resonate with you, if the quiet unraveling of truth, the weight of hidden motives, and the fragile line between loyalty and deception speaks to something inside you, stay close. There are more stories waiting, and each one reminds us how easily the familiar can become the dangerous. Do you think justice was truly served in this case, or does something still feel unfinished? Share your thoughts. And if you want more investigations that bring buried betrayals into the light, stay connected so you don't miss the next time a secret is finally exposed.